In the early 13th century, Europe was a continent in flux, where kingdoms and empires fought for dominance and influence. Among the many figures who rose to prominence during this turbulent period, one stands out not just for his military prowess or political cunning, but for his vision of a united, enlightened empire: Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, King of Sicily, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and a man whose intellect and reformist ideals would forever change the course of history. But behind every great ruler lies a partnership that is often overlooked by history, a partnership that shapes not only the ruler's destiny but the future of the empire itself. For Frederick II, that partner was Constance of Aragon, a princess whose marriage to him in 1209 would become one of the most pivotal alliances of the medieval world. At the time of their union, Constance was not just a woman of beauty and grace. She was a political pawn in the grand chess game of European dynasties. Born into the royal family of Aragon, her marriage was designed to secure power and bring stability to the volatile Mediterranean region. Yet, as we will see, Constance's role was far more than that of a mere consort. Her intellect, her determination, and her unwavering devotion to her family and kingdom would prove vital in helping Frederick rise to power and lay the foundation for his ambitious rule. Together, Frederick and Constance would shape the destiny of Sicily, the Holy Roman Empire, and their descendants. Their union, though born out of political necessity, would forge a legacy that transcended their time. And yet, Constance's story is often overshadowed by her more famous husband. Today, we look back not just at the man Frederick II, but at the queen who stood beside him, the woman whose actions, wisdom, and sacrifices helped secure the future of an empire. This is the story of Constance of Aragon, a queen whose legacy was intertwined with the rise and fall of empires, and whose influence would extend far beyond her death. From her early years as a princess in the courts of Aragon to her final days as the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, Constance's life was marked by triumphs, struggles, and a profound impact on the world she left behind. Through her eyes, we will explore the challenges and choices that defined her, and how she changed the course of history for her husband, her son, and her kingdom. In the sun-soaked lands of Aragon, nestled between the rugged mountains and the azure Mediterranean Sea, a young princess was born into a world of intricate alliances and shifting political landscapes. Constance of Aragon, daughter of King Alfonso II and Queen Theresia of Puglia, came into the world at a time when the kingdoms of Spain and Italy were embroiled in a delicate balance of power. Her early life was shaped not by the carefree joys of childhood, but by the heavy expectations placed on her as a princess, a key figure in the ever-complicated game of dynastic politics. From the moment of her birth in 1194, Constance's life was destined to be one of political intrigue and strategic importance. Her father, Alfonso II, ruled over the Kingdom of Aragon, a region whose borders stretched from the Pyrenees to the Mediterranean, encompassing both parts of modern-day Spain and France. The Kingdom of Aragon was a powerful entity, but like many medieval realms, it was often at odds with neighboring territories. The threat of rival dynasties, particularly those from Castile, Navarre, and Sicily, loomed large over the Aragonese crown. Constance's mother, Theresia of Puglia, was no stranger to the complexities of royal life. Having been born into the noble family of Puglia, she had married Alfonso II to solidify an alliance between Aragon and the southern Italian territories. The merging of these two royal houses made Constance's birth all the more significant. She was not just a daughter of Aragon. She was a potential bridge to a new future, one that could secure her family's influence across the Mediterranean. As a child, Constance was raised in the royal court of Zaragoza, the capital of Aragon, a city that pulsed with the sounds of poets, philosophers, and scholars. Her education was rigorous, her lessons filled with the arts of diplomacy, statecraft, and history. Though her upbringing was one of privilege, she was acutely aware of the role she was meant to play, not just as a daughter of a king, but as a future queen who would be called upon to make decisions that would reverberate through the halls of empires. By the time Constance reached her teenage years, Europe was embroiled in political tensions that would shape the course of history. The Kingdom of Sicily, to the south, was a land of great wealth and strategic importance. It was a land coveted by many, most notably Frederick II, the ambitious and intellectually gifted heir to the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick had already begun to make his mark in Europe, and his growing power would soon intersect with Constance's destiny in ways that neither could have foreseen. But it was not just her father's ambitions that shaped Constance's future. Her mother, Theresia, was a shrewd and politically astute woman. She understood that in a world where royal marriages often determined the fate of entire kingdoms, Constance's beauty, intelligence, and noble lineage made her a powerful bargaining chip. With the right marriage, Constance could help secure the throne of Sicily for Aragon, or at the very least, secure an advantageous alliance that would strengthen the kingdom's position in the Mediterranean. It was through these lenses of diplomacy, strategy, and empire building that Constance's marriage was arranged. The man she was destined to marry was none other than Frederick II, a ruler whose ambitions extended far beyond the borders of his native Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick was a man who saw the world not as a collection of disparate states but as a single entity, one that could be united under a single, powerful ruler. His desire for Sicily was not just about territorial expansion. It was about creating a new world order, one that could challenge the old feudal structures and establish a more enlightened, centralized governance. For Constance, the marriage to Frederick was not born of love or passion, but of political necessity. When the marriage contract was signed in 1209, it was the culmination of years of negotiation and maneuvering. Aragon, seeking to secure its position in the Mediterranean, saw an alliance with the future Holy Roman Emperor as a way to strengthen its claim to Sicily. Frederick, for his part, sought a queen who would bring with her not just a dowry, but the power and prestige of the Aragonese crown. As she prepared to leave the familiar shores of Spain for the unknown world of Sicily, Constance knew that her life would never be the same. She was not merely a princess being handed off to another royal house. She was a key player in a game that stretched from the hills of Aragon to the courts of Rome. Her marriage to Frederick was a doorway into a new world, one that would test her resilience, intelligence, and courage in ways she had never imagined. In the vibrant courts of Sicily, where Greek, Arab, and Norman cultures mingled freely, Constance would soon discover that her role was far more than that of a political pawn. The land she was about to enter was one of contradictions, beautiful yet dangerous, cultured yet volatile. Sicily had been, for centuries, a battleground for competing forces, and as queen, Constance would have to navigate these complexities with a keen eye and a steady hand. The marriage between Constance and Frederick II, while politically advantageous, would prove to be far more than just a union of crowns. It would be the beginning of a partnership that would leave an indelible mark on the history of the Holy Roman Empire, on the Kingdom of Sicily, and on the future of Europe itself. In the coming years, Constance's role as queen would evolve from that of a dutiful wife to a powerful force in her own right, an intelligent and capable ruler who would prove that a queen could wield as much influence as any king. But in these early years, before she stepped onto the stage of history, Constance was just a young woman, newly married, unsure of the challenges and responsibilities that awaited her. The weight of her family's expectations, the pressures of her royal duties, and the uncharted waters of a marriage to one of Europe's most ambitious rulers all loomed large. And yet, as the winds of fate blew her toward the shores of Sicily, Constance could not have known that her journey was only beginning, that the choices she would make in the coming years would change the course of history and cement her place as one of the most influential women of her time. The journey from the sunlit hills of Aragon to the Mediterranean shores of Sicily was not one Constance had eagerly anticipated. For a princess, Marriage was often a calculated step in the grand strategy of dynastic politics, a duty rather than a choice. Constance, while raised in the court of Zaragoza with all the luxury and refinement a princess could ask for, was keenly aware that her role was to secure alliances and bolster her family's power, not to seek personal happiness or fulfillment. When the news of her engagement to Frederick II, the future Holy Roman Emperor, reached her ears in 1209, Constance was both apprehensive and resolute. She had grown up hearing of his ambitions, his intellectual brilliance, and his unique vision of empire, one that sought not only to consolidate the various realms under the banner of the Holy Roman Empire, but also to bring a sense of rational order to a fragmented Europe. But to marry such a man, whose reputation for power and brilliance often bordered on the legendary, was an entirely different matter. Sicily, too, was a land of great contrast. It was a kingdom where ancient Roman, Byzantine, Arab, and Norman influences had collided over centuries. Its capital, Palermo, was a thriving metropolis, a cultural crossroads where art, science, and philosophy flourished under the patronage of successive rulers. Constance knew that in marrying Frederick, she would not only be leaving behind her homeland but stepping into a world rich with possibility, but also fraught with political tension and intrigue. As the day of her departure drew nearer, Constance began to prepare herself for the journey ahead. She took solace in the thought that, while her marriage to Frederick was politically motivated, it held the promise of uniting two great powers, Aragon and Sicily, into one formidable force in the Mediterranean. This, she knew, would solidify her family's legacy, ensuring its place in the annals of history. When Constance finally arrived in Palermo in 1210, the city greeted her with an air of both opulence and mystery. She was no longer a princess of Aragon, a daughter of the Pyrenees. She was now a queen, the consort of Frederick II, whose court was a beacon of both intellectual achievement and feudal power. The marriage had been orchestrated with great fanfare, and the people of Sicily, accustomed to the ever-changing tides of political leadership, were curious to see how this new queen would fit into their world. Frederick II, for his part, had not arrived in Sicily as an unknown ruler. Though he was still young, his ambitions were already taking shape. As the heir to the Holy Roman Empire, he had already begun to carve out a reputation as a reformer, a ruler who sought to break free from the feudal systems that had long held sway in Europe. His plans for Sicily were ambitious, and he envisioned the island as a central hub for his broader imperial goals. First, Constance's role in the court of Frederick seemed clear. As queen, her primary duties were to bear him children, an heir to the throne, preferably a son, and to maintain the stability of the court through her presence and influence. Yet, Frederick was not a man who believed in the traditional roles of kings and queens. He valued intellect and skill above all else. And though Constance had been raised to be the dutiful wife, she quickly found that Frederick's expectations of her were not those of a passive consort. Frederick had long been a patron of scholars, philosophers, and scientists. His court was a gathering place for some of the most brilliant minds of Europe and the Middle East, and it was not long before Constance found herself caught up in the intellectual ferment that defined his reign. She was not merely expected to sit silently at his side during court gatherings. She was encouraged to contribute, to listen, and to learn. The two of them began to share a bond not just of political necessity, but of intellectual partnership. Though Constance was initially unsure of her place in this world of intellectualism and reform, she quickly adapted to the environment that Frederick had cultivated. She became an important figure in the court, not just as a queen, but as an advisor, helping to navigate the complex political relationships that define the Mediterranean. Her keen mind and ability to read the shifting tides of diplomacy made her an invaluable asset to Frederick, who, despite his brilliance, often found it difficult to balance the competing demands of his various kingdoms. Their relationship, while still rooted in political strategy, began to evolve into something more nuanced. Frederick came to admire Constance not only for her beauty and grace, but also for her insight and understanding of the intricate webs of power and loyalty that held the Mediterranean world together. Constance, in turn, began to see Frederick not just as a ruler, but as a man of exceptional intellect, someone whose vision for the future of Europe mirrored her own desires for a more enlightened and ordered world. The birth of their first child in 1211, a son, whom they named Henry VII, further solidified their bond. As the heir to the throne of Sicily, Henry represented the future of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the union of Frederick's Holy Roman Empire and Constance's Aragonese legacy. The birth of a son was a pivotal moment, both personally and politically, as it ensured that the Hohenstaufen line would continue to thrive. For Constance, the joy of motherhood was coupled with the weight of expectation. She was now not only a queen and a wife, but the mother of the future ruler of Sicily. But motherhood was not without its challenges. As the political landscape in Europe continued to shift, so too did the pressures on Constance. The Mediterranean was a region of constant flux, where rival kingdoms and competing dynasties often threatened to destabilize the fragile alliances that held the region together. Constance and Frederick would soon find that their union, though strong, would be tested by the tides of history in ways they had not yet imagined. As time went on, Constance's role in the court of Frederick II would continue to evolve. Her intellect, her diplomatic skill, and her growing influence over the affairs of Sicily made her an indispensable partner in Frederick's quest to reshape the empire. In the coming years, as she faced personal losses, political upheavals, and the complexities of a royal marriage, Constance would prove to be far more than just a queen in name alone. She would become a force in her own right, a queen whose actions would leave an indelible mark on the history of Europe. Constance's early days in Palermo had been filled with the challenges of navigating a new court, a new culture, and an unfamiliar world. But as the months passed and she settled into her new role as Queen of Sicily, something more profound began to unfold. While the marriage had been arranged for political reasons, Constance was no longer simply a passive figurehead in her husband's court. She had become an active participant in the grand design of Frederick II, a woman whose intelligence and capabilities would soon prove indispensable in the turbulent world of medieval politics. Frederick, who had long been known for his ambitious plans and reformist tendencies, was not a conventional monarch. He sought not only to expand his empire but also to transform it into something more centralized, more enlightened, and more efficient. His fascination with science, philosophy, and law was matched only by his desire to bring about systemic change. Sicily, with its mix of Norman, Arab, Byzantine, and Italian influences, was a rich tapestry of culture and opportunity. And it was here that Frederick hoped to create a model kingdom that would set the tone for his wider imperial ambitions. In this environment, Constance began to realize the true extent of her role. While it was clear that her primary responsibility was to bear heirs, particularly a male heir to secure the dynasty, it became increasingly apparent that Frederick saw her as a trusted partner in governance. She was not just a queen who graced the halls of the palace with her presence. She was a political asset whose understanding of diplomacy and statecraft could no longer be ignored. At court, Constance was frequently consulted by Frederick on matters of state. Her sharp mind and knowledge of the intricacies of European politics made her a valuable advisor. The two of them began to engage in regular discussions about the future of Sicily, the challenges they faced with rival kingdoms, and the difficulties of maintaining a delicate balance of power. While Frederick often dominated the conversation with his forceful ideas and grand ambitions, Constance's voice was one of reason and pragmatism. She brought a level-headed perspective to Frederick's sometimes visionary, sometimes reckless proposals. One area in which Constance particularly shone was in managing the court itself. She had been raised in the royal court of Aragon, where diplomacy was an art form and alliances were forged as much through personal relationships as through political strategy. Her mother, Queen Theresia, had taught her the value of patronage, negotiation, and the power of subtlety. Constance applied these lessons to her role as queen, fostering alliances with key nobles, managing rivalries, and ensuring that the power dynamics within the court worked in her favor. But her influence went beyond the halls of the palace. Sicily, during Frederick's reign, became a crossroads of cultural and intellectual exchange. Frederick had invited scholars from across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa to his court. The king himself, a polymath with an insatiable curiosity, encouraged advancements in every field, from law to medicine to astronomy. Constance, though not as publicly engaged in the academic pursuits as her husband, shared his interest in the intellectual movement that was beginning to define the island. She became a patron of the arts and learning, sponsoring projects that would preserve and expand the knowledge of the ancient world while also embracing the new ideas of the time. Her court became a place where poets, artists, and scholars gathered to exchange ideas, creating a unique cultural blend that would come to define Frederick's reign. Sicily, under their joint leadership, became not just a military and political stronghold but also a beacon of intellectualism, where the best minds of the age could come together to challenge traditional ideas and shape the future. Despite her growing influence, Constance's position at court was not without its challenges. The political landscape of medieval Europe was treacherous, and rivals to the Hohenstaufen dynasty were never far from Frederick's doorstep. The Holy Roman Empire itself, with its fractured factions and competing interests, was a constant source of tension. Constance often found herself playing the role of mediator between her husband and those who opposed his vision, whether they were nobles within Sicily, ambitious Italian city-states, or even the papacy, which had long been wary of Frederick's growing power. Her diplomatic skills were put to the test on numerous occasions. In one notable instance, Constance helped Frederick navigate a particularly precarious standoff with the papacy. The Pope, Innocent III, had long been an adversary to Frederick, seeing his power as a threat to the Church's authority. When tensions reached a boiling point in the early 1210s, it was Constance who stepped forward to mediate, using her familial ties and her deep understanding of both the Church's needs and Frederick's ambitions to broker a delicate truce. This episode marked a turning point in Constance's political career. She was no longer seen simply as a queen consort, but as a force in her own right, one whose influence extended beyond the personal sphere and into the very heart of European politics. Meanwhile, her relationship with Frederick continued to evolve. While their marriage had started as a pragmatic alliance, it grew into something far deeper. Frederick, who had long been a man of intellect and ambition, came to see in Constance a kindred spirit, a woman whose sharp mind and political acumen matched his own. Constance, in turn, began to recognize the complexities of Frederick's vision for Europe and came to admire not just his leadership, but his drive to create a more just and orderly world. Their intellectual connection became the foundation of their relationship, and together they would strive to build an empire that would stand the test of time. The birth of their son, Henry VII, in 1211, only added to their bond. The child represented the future not only of their family but also of their vision for the Mediterranean and beyond. Constance, who had long understood the importance of securing a male heir, found in Henry not just a personal joy, but a symbol of the continuity of their shared ambitions. Frederick, for all his intellectual and political power, was deeply invested in securing the future of his dynasty, and Constance played a key role in ensuring that Henry's upbringing would prepare him to inherit not just the throne of Sicily, but the broader legacy of the Hohenstaufen family. But as their power grew, so too did the challenges. The delicate balance between the various factions at court, the Church's ever-watchful eye, and the rivalries with other European dynasties meant that Frederick and Constance were constantly engaged in a complex dance of diplomacy, intrigue, and strategy. Constance's role as a queen was more than just ceremonial. She was deeply involved in every aspect of her husband's reign, and her contributions to the kingdom's success were increasingly recognized. However, Even as Constance's power and influence grew, she remained grounded in the principles of her early upbringing. She was a queen who knew the importance of loyalty, of maintaining the support of the nobility, and of carefully managing the alliances that would keep the Hohenstaufen dynasty in power. In the court of Frederick II, Constance was not just his wife. She was his partner, his confidant, and a key architect of his vision for the future of Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire. As Constance settled deeper into her role as Queen of Sicily, the political landscape of Europe was beginning to change. The years following the birth of her son, Henry VII, in 1211, brought with them new challenges, both within the Hohenstaufen court and beyond. Frederick II's vision of a unified, enlightened empire was ever more ambitious, but it was also increasingly threatened by external pressures and internal divisions. Frederick, a man of prodigious intellectual talent and boundless energy, had already secured a remarkable position for himself. As the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he had the ear of Europe's most powerful kings and popes, yet his focus on consolidating power was often met with resistance. The political climate in Europe was volatile, and while he was undoubtedly an innovator, he was also seen as a threat to the established order. The papacy, under Pope Innocent III and later his successors, was particularly concerned by Frederick's rising power. The papacy had long held sway over European monarchs, demanding loyalty from kings and emperors alike. But Frederick, with his ambition and independence, was a monarch who refused to bow to the papal crown. His vision for Sicily and, by extension, his larger imperial ambitions often put him at odds with Rome. At the same time, the Kingdom of Sicily, under Frederick's rule, had become a place of relative prosperity, intellectual growth, and cultural fusion. The island had been reshaped into a hub of knowledge, where scholars from across Europe and the Muslim world exchanged ideas. Frederick's interest in philosophy, science, and law was infused into the fabric of Sicilian society. Constance, though never as publicly celebrated for her intellectual pursuits as her husband, had played an instrumental role in fostering this environment. Her patronage of the arts and scholarship had ensured that Sicily remained not only a political and military stronghold, but also a center of learning. But prosperity did not always guarantee peace. Frederick's military campaigns, aimed at expanding his empire, drew the attention of rival monarchs and cities across Italy and beyond. The papacy's growing unease with Frederick's ambitions led to the delicate balancing act of diplomacy that Constance would increasingly have to manage. The question of Sicily's future, and of the future of the Hohenstaufen dynasty itself, hung in the balance. As much as Constance had grown into her role, navigating the delicate politics of her court, she was soon confronted with challenges far beyond her control. In the early 1220s, the political situation in Europe began to spiral toward a crisis. One of the most immediate threats came from the rival Hohenstaufen branch in the south of Italy, led by the powerful Emperor Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire. Otto, who had long coveted Frederick's throne, began to push for his own claims over Sicily, threatening to destabilize Frederick's carefully constructed empire. The papacy, sensing an opportunity to undermine Frederick's growing influence, lent its support to Otto. Pope Honorius III, who had succeeded Innocent III, made a public declaration against Frederick's reign, accusing him of overstepping his boundaries and threatening the balance of power in Europe. The Pope's influence was considerable, and many of Frederick's allies began to waver, their loyalty shaken by the mounting pressure from Rome. Constance, ever the astute politician, recognized the gravity of the situation. Her knowledge of diplomacy and alliances, honed in her native Aragon, had become more important than ever. She knew that her husband, while brilliant and ambitious, was often consumed by his own ideas and the demands of empire. It was in these moments of crisis that Constance's steady hand would prove invaluable. In 1222, When Pope Honorius III excommunicated Frederick for his refusal to participate in a crusade in the Holy Land, Constance took a decisive step. Understanding the danger of alienating Rome, she personally intervened in negotiations, acting as a mediator between her husband and the papacy. Constance's diplomatic efforts were delicate and complex. She sought to maintain the balance of power between Frederick's imperial ambitions and the Church's authority, all while ensuring that the Kingdom of Sicily remained stable and unified. In the court of Frederick II, Constance's role had evolved from that of a political pawn to that of a queen whose counsel was sought not only by her husband but by other European rulers as well. She was often the quiet force behind the throne, shaping decisions in subtle yet profound ways. As tensions mounted between the papacy and the Hohenstaufen dynasty, her ability to manage these external pressures, while ensuring the continued loyalty of the nobles and military leaders within Sicily, became one of her greatest assets. Yet, while Constance was deeply involved in the political machinations of the time, she also faced personal challenges. The birth of her second child, Manfred, in 1220, had brought her joy, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. With two sons, Constance understood that the future of the Hohenstaufen dynasty now lay squarely on her shoulders. The stability of her children's inheritance and the future of Frederick's empire rested in her ability to maintain peace at home and abroad. But the external threats continued to grow. In 1225, Constance's political astuteness was put to the test once again when King James I of Aragon, her brother, began to assert claims over the island of Sardinia, which had long been under the control of the Kingdom of Sicily. This conflict, coupled with the continuing tensions with the papacy, placed an even greater strain on Constance's ability to balance the competing interests of her family, her kingdom, and her husband's empire. Her efforts to maintain peace within the Hohenstaufen realms, however, were continually hampered by Frederick's military ambitions and his unwillingness to compromise with the papacy. As tensions escalated, Constance found herself at the center of a complex political web, where every decision could have far-reaching consequences. Despite the mounting pressures, Constance remained a steady presence in Frederick's court. She was his advisor, his confidant, and his partner in the struggle to maintain the Hohenstaufen dynasty's dominance in the Mediterranean. But as the years passed, and the political landscape became ever more treacherous, Constance would soon find herself facing the most difficult challenge of all: the question of succession. As the 1220s unfolded, the political situation around Constance and Frederick began to take on an increasingly precarious edge. The Hohenstaufen dynasty, though powerful and influential, was surrounded by enemies both old and new. The papacy, eager to reclaim its dominance, continued to undermine Frederick's power, while other European monarchs sought to weaken his empire for their own gain. Meanwhile, the internal politics of Sicily became more complicated as the various factions within the kingdom jostled for power. The birth of Constance's second son, Manfred, in 1220, had been a cause for celebration, yet it also marked a shift in the balance of power. The Hohenstaufen dynasty now had two heirs, Henry VII, the firstborn, and the younger Manfred. The question of succession, though not immediately pressing, began to loom large. In the medieval world, where royal inheritance was often contested and unstable, the mere presence of two male heirs raised the specter of division, rivalry, and civil strife. Constance, fully aware of the risks of dynastic struggles, could not afford to ignore the complex politics surrounding her children's futures. Frederick, for all his intellect and political savvy, had never been one to shy away from a fight. His reign over Sicily had brought with it numerous military campaigns against the papacy, against rivals in Italy, and against the various Muslim forces in the Mediterranean. Yet, while he was adept at warfare and diplomacy, Frederick's focus on his imperial ambitions sometimes blinded him to the delicate balance of power within his own family. He had worked tirelessly to consolidate his power, to secure his empire, but his vision often overlooked the realities of succession and the potential for discord within his own household. In 1225, the issue of succession came to a head in a way that no one, not even Constance, could have foreseen. Frederick, in an effort to strengthen his position and secure alliances, arranged a politically motivated marriage between his son, Henry VII, and Margaret of Navarre, the heiress to a large swath of territory in the north. This marriage, while intended to secure Frederick's hold on power, created new challenges. Margaret's own claim to various lands and titles brought her into direct competition with Constance's children, particularly Manfred, who was already being groomed as the future ruler of Sicily. The marriage of Henry and Margaret marked the first serious test of Constance's ability to navigate the treacherous waters of succession politics. As the mother of both Henry and Manfred, Constance was in a unique position to influence the course of the dynasty's future. She knew that, despite her loyalty to her husband, Frederick's decisions often carried risks that could fracture their children's inheritance and, by extension, the future of the Hohenstaufen legacy. In addition to the marriage of Henry, another complication arose from the growing pressure from the papacy. Pope Gregory IX, who succeeded Pope Honorius III in 1227, was a relentless adversary of Frederick. The Pope's mistrust of the emperor's power, combined with his fear of Frederick's rising influence, meant that Gregory sought any opportunity to weaken Frederick's grip on Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire. Excommunication was frequently used as a political tool against Frederick, and Constance, though a staunch ally of her husband, could not ignore the growing influence of the papacy in European affairs. In the midst of this political storm, Constance found herself torn between her loyalty to her husband and her deep concern for the future of her children. As the mother of the heirs to the Hohenstaufen throne, she understood better than anyone the dangers of rivalry and division. The papacy had already taken a stance against Frederick's rule, and the machinations of rival monarchs meant that there was no guarantee that the Hohenstaufen dynasty would remain intact. Constance had witnessed firsthand how the absence of a clear succession could lead to the fragmentation of powerful empires. She had seen it in the histories of countless European kingdoms: the division of lands, the bitter wars over succession, the fratricide and intrigue that often accompanied the death of a monarch. She was determined not to let that fate befall her children, and she knew that a decisive and careful plan for their future was essential to securing the legacy of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Frederick's attention was increasingly consumed by his campaigns abroad. In 1228, he finally embarked on a crusade to the Holy Land, an endeavor that had been delayed for years by his struggles with the papacy. While he was away, Constance took on an even more significant role in the governance of Sicily. She was the regent of the kingdom, overseeing its affairs, managing its resources, and ensuring that the nobility remained loyal to the Hohenstaufen cause. This was a critical time for Constance, as the kingdom's future was in her hands. While Frederick was in the Holy Land, Constance's political maneuvering became even more essential. She worked tirelessly to maintain the unity of the Sicilian court, but she also sought to strengthen the ties between Sicily and her native Aragon. Her brother, James I of Aragon, had long been an ally of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and Constance sought to use her family connections to safeguard her children's interests. At the same time, she worked behind the scenes to protect the legitimacy of both Henry and Manfred, ensuring that neither would be sidelined in the pursuit of the Hohenstaufen throne. But even as Constance worked to secure her children's future, the tensions between Frederick and the papacy continued to escalate. In 1230, Gregory IX excommunicated Frederick once more, accusing him of violating his crusader vow and undermining the authority of the church. This was a dangerous moment for the emperor and his family. Excommunication was not just a spiritual penalty, it was a political weapon, one that threatened to turn Frederick's subjects, including the nobility of Sicily, against him. Constance, always the pragmatist, understood that the situation could not be allowed to fester. she began diplomatic negotiations with Rome, seeking a resolution that would remove the excommunication and restore the stability of the kingdom. The stakes were high: the legitimacy of Frederick's rule, the future of Sicily, and the unity of the Hohenstaufen dynasty were all at risk. In 1231, a temporary agreement was reached between Frederick and the papacy, lifting the excommunication and easing tensions between the two powers. But while this was a victory for Frederick and Constance, it was also a reminder of the delicate balance that they had to maintain. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, and the future of the Hohenstaufen dynasty was anything but certain. As Constance looked to the future, she knew that her children's fate would be inextricably linked to the ever-shifting tides of European politics. Her efforts to safeguard the succession would be crucial in the years to come. With Frederick's return from the crusade imminent, Constance's influence in the court of Sicily was stronger than ever. But the looming specter of dynastic struggle, of competing claims, rivalries, and the inevitable contest for power cast a long shadow over the future of the Hohenstaufen legacy. The year 1230 had been a momentous one for Constance and the Hohenstaufen dynasty. The agreement with Pope Gregory IX had temporarily lifted the excommunication on Frederick, and peace, however fragile, returned to the kingdom. Yet, despite this victory in the diplomatic sphere, Constance faced a deeper, more insidious challenge: the toll of Frederick's crusade. Frederick II had long harbored the ambition of becoming the ruler of Jerusalem. His status as both Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and King of Sicily gave him a unique position in European politics. But his greatest dream was to claim the title of King of Jerusalem. This ambition was what had ultimately led him to the crusade, a military campaign that, despite the papacy's excommunication, he had managed to lead on his own terms. Frederick, ever the strategist, negotiated a peace settlement with the Muslims in the Holy Land, resulting in a bloodless conquest of Jerusalem in 1229. It was a remarkable achievement, a victory of diplomacy over the bloodshed that usually marked the Crusades. Yet, for Constance, it was a bittersweet success. Frederick's absence during this period was felt deeply in Sicily. Though Constance had been left as the regent of the kingdom, the very fabric of their joint rule was stretched thin. The absence of her husband, whom she had relied on not just as a political partner but as a co-architect of their shared empire, placed Constance under immense pressure. It was no longer enough to simply maintain the kingdom's internal stability. She had to manage the growing external threats that loomed over Sicily, from both within and beyond the kingdom's borders. As Frederick basked in the glow of his triumph in the Holy Land, Constance was left to contend with the growing factionalism within Sicily itself. The papacy, still wary of Frederick's increasing power, had continued to rally opposition to his rule, especially from the powerful Italian city-states and rival noble families. The fragile alliance between Sicily and the papacy, brokered through Constance's diplomatic efforts, had begun to fray once more, and tensions between the church and the Hohenstaufen dynasty were as high as ever. At the heart of this political turbulence was the issue of succession. Constance, more than anyone, understood the risks of dynastic division. With Frederick focused on the crusade and the conquest of Jerusalem, the question of his heirs loomed large. Her son Henry VII, who had been married to Margaret of Navarre, was still young, and his influence was largely confined to the northern reaches of the empire. Meanwhile, Manfred, her second son, had not yet secured his place in the court and had begun to assert his own ambitions. The birth of Constance's third child, a daughter named Beatrice, in 1231, brought her momentary joy, but in a world where dynastic power depended on male heirs, Beatrice's arrival did little to ease the pressure on Constance. The situation was increasingly volatile, and the threat of civil war between the factions supporting Henry and Manfred was becoming more than just a distant possibility. Constance, despite her diplomatic acumen, found herself caught in a storm she could not entirely control. even as she worked tirelessly to maintain unity within the kingdom. The fracturing of her own family loomed as a constant threat. It was during this period of instability that Frederick, now secure in his title as King of Jerusalem, returned to Sicily in 1231. However, his return was not met with the triumph and fanfare that Constance had hoped for. The years of absence had altered the political landscape of Sicily, and Frederick's sudden reappearance only seemed to further stir the pot. He was hailed as the hero who had conquered Jerusalem, but the realities of his absence had taken their toll on the stability of his empire. The factions that had grown in his absence, those aligned with various branches of the Hohenstaufen family, now posed a direct threat to his rule. Constance, ever pragmatic, recognized the urgency of restoring order. With Frederick's return, the Hohenstaufen court was once again filled with the tension of competing interests. Frederick, eager to solidify his position and secure the future of his dynasty, convened a council to address the question of succession once and for all. Constance, knowing how critical this moment was, took a prominent role in the discussions, advocating for a solution that would avoid civil war and secure the future of her children. The council's proceedings were marked by deep divides. Frederick, while ultimately supportive of his sons, was intent on securing Henry's place as his successor. The marriage between Henry and Margaret of Navarre had given Frederick access to valuable territories in northern Europe, and he saw his eldest son as the key to solidifying his imperial legacy. Manfred, however, was not so easily sidelined. As a younger son, he had no territories to claim, but he had inherited his father's fiery spirit and ambition, though his mother, Constance, had long sought to keep him as a loyal supporter of Frederick. Manfred's aspirations for power had begun to challenge the stability of the dynasty. Frederick and Constance, despite their shared vision, began to find themselves on opposite sides of the growing conflict. Constance, while loyal to Frederick, understood the danger of a single heir holding all the power. She knew that the delicate balance of the Hohenstaufen legacy would be shattered if one son was favored over the other. In this crucial moment, Constance's role as the mediator became even more vital. She argued passionately that both sons should be given roles in the kingdom, each with their own responsibilities and influence. She proposed a division of power, where Henry would lead the northern territories while Manfred would govern Sicily itself. The challenge was immense. To avoid a divided kingdom, Constance needed to secure a peace between the factions and ensure that both sons would be loyal to their father's ultimate vision. Frederick, however, was a man of grand designs. His imperial ambitions, his desire to consolidate power and shape Europe in his image, led him to make the fateful decision to elevate Henry above Manfred. The tension between father and son would soon reach a breaking point. Constance, ever pragmatic, understood the gravity of the decision. She knew that this rift, if left unchecked, could tear the Hohenstaufen dynasty apart. The year 1232 saw Frederick's decision confirmed. Henry would be groomed as the successor to the Holy Roman Empire, while Manfred would be pushed aside. Constance's influence had waned in the face of Frederick's imperial vision. The decision marked a turning point in the history of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, one that would reverberate for decades. Manfred, feeling betrayed, began to grow increasingly restless, his loyalty to his father and his older brother weakening. As the political winds shifted and the rift between Frederick and Manfred widened, Constance's role in the court of Sicily became increasingly tenuous. Her ability to navigate the complexities of the Hohenstaufen family was tested to the limits. She had fought for unity, for peace, but in the end, her efforts had been overshadowed by Frederick's towering ambition and the dynasty's internal struggles. For Constance, the future was uncertain. She had been the glue that held the kingdom together during the most tumultuous years of Frederick's reign. But now, as the specter of civil war between her children loomed ever closer, she found herself facing a bitter reality. The unity she had once worked so hard to achieve was slipping through her fingers, and the kingdom she had helped build was on the edge of collapse. The year 1232 had been a turning point for the Hohenstaufen family. Constance, though ever faithful to Frederick and her children, had come to see that the world around her was no longer one where unity could be easily preserved. The political maneuverings within the Hohenstaufen court had created a growing divide between her two sons, and the tension between Frederick and Manfred began to take on a new, dangerous character. Manfred's disillusionment with his father's choices simmered beneath the surface, but it was becoming clearer each day that the foundations of loyalty that had once bound the family together were starting to crack. In many ways, Constance had always been the pragmatic force in the court, calm, collected, and aware of the delicate political dance that had to be performed at all times. But even she could not ignore the bitter reality. Frederick's decision to elevate Henry as his heir had alienated Manfred in ways that could no longer be swept aside. The father's ambition for his empire, combined with his desire to ensure that his son Henry would inherit both his imperial and Sicilian titles, had created a rift in the family that was impossible to repair. Constance, as always, sought a middle ground, but she could feel that the balance was beginning to tip toward crisis. Frederick's reign, which had once seemed like an almost unassailable force in Europe, was now facing a threat from within. The rivalry between Henry and Manfred grew more pronounced as each son began to seek support for their own claim to power. Manfred, though still young and without substantial lands of his own, had the full ambition of his father, as well as his own charismatic presence, which made him a popular figure in Sicily. Many of the nobles of the kingdom, including powerful families from southern Italy and the island itself, began to rally behind him. They saw in Manfred not only a son of Frederick but a future leader who might return to the traditions of Sicilian self-rule, where power was more decentralized, and the island's interests were kept at the forefront. This appeal to local pride, to the unique identity of Sicily, was something Constance had tried to nurture since the beginning of her marriage. But now, it was threatening to undo everything Frederick had worked to achieve. The support for Manfred was not purely political. It was, in many ways, a manifestation of a deep-seated resentment of Frederick's centralizing ambitions. The aristocracy in Sicily, long accustomed to a certain degree of autonomy, feared that the more Frederick expanded his imperial authority, the more he would erode their own power. They were wary of the increasing militarization of the kingdom, the rise of central bureaucratic control, and Frederick's reliance on German and other foreign troops. Manfred, with his Sicilian roots and his promising charisma, seemed like the man who could restore the old ways, the ways of a more independent, localized rule that would safeguard the unique cultural and political identity of the kingdom. Constance, caught in the middle of this growing conflict, began to understand the gravity of the situation, though she had always worked behind the scenes, pulling the strings to keep the kingdom together. The growing rift between her sons threatened the very fabric of their empire. Manfred, once a loyal son, was now challenging the path that Frederick had set for him. As the nobles began to support Manfred, Constance found herself facing an agonizing dilemma. How could she remain loyal to Frederick and his vision, while also ensuring that the future of her children and her kingdom was not torn apart by this burgeoning rebellion? The growing discontent came to a head in 1233, when Manfred, with the support of powerful Sicilian nobles, openly rebelled against his father. The political climate had shifted. Manfred, in a dramatic move, seized control of key cities in Sicily, including Palermo, the heart of the Hohenstaufen kingdom. It was an audacious act, one that shook the foundations of Frederick's empire. With Manfred's uprising, the delicate balance Constance had so carefully maintained came crashing down. Frederick, who had been embroiled in his imperial duties and in his ongoing conflicts with the papacy, was forced to turn his attention to Sicily once more. But even as he prepared to confront his son's rebellion, Frederick found himself in a precarious position. The legitimacy of his rule was now being questioned not just by the church, but by his own blood. Constance, ever the loyal wife and mother, found herself torn between her duty to Frederick and her love for her son, Manfred. She had raised him with the same care and affection as Henry, and the thought of his rebellion against his father, his betrayal, in some eyes, tore at her heart. As the military conflict between father and son began to unfold, Constance took a step back from the political center. No longer the active regent she once was, she became more of a passive observer, weighing the decisions of both men in her heart. She could not, and would not, condone Manfred's open rebellion, but neither could she abandon him to the consequences of his actions. Constance knew all too well that this was a family tragedy, and that, no matter the outcome, it would change the future of the Hohenstaufen dynasty forever. While Frederick moved quickly to suppress the rebellion, sending his forces to retake the key cities that Manfred had seized, he also understood that his own legitimacy was on the line. The rebellion, despite being led by his own son, had a groundswell of support from the Sicilian people, many of whom were sympathetic to Manfred's desire for a more autonomous kingdom. The situation was not as simple as Frederick had hoped. It was no longer just a matter of punishing his son and restoring order. If he crushed Manfred's rebellion too ruthlessly, he risked losing the support of the very people he had worked so hard to win over. Constance, now increasingly isolated from the political decisions being made, continued to face a private struggle. She knew the stakes for both Frederick and Manfred. She knew that one of them would have to be sacrificed to maintain the integrity of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. The question was not whether Frederick or Manfred would win. It was which future she would choose for Sicily, for her children, and for the legacy of the empire her husband had spent so many years building. The year 1234 saw a pivotal moment in the rebellion. Manfred, realizing the enormity of the challenge he faced, began to gather a broader coalition of supporters, including disaffected nobles from southern Italy who had long resented Frederick's centralized power. Meanwhile, Frederick's forces, bolstered by loyalists, launched a series of counterattacks against Manfred's positions. The conflict became increasingly bitter, marked by sieges and raids across the island. In the midst of the war, Constance's position in the court became more tenuous. Her influence was no longer as significant, and she had become a figure caught between two warring sides of her own blood. The public spectacle of father and son in open conflict became a symbol of the division within the Hohenstaufen family, a division that Constance had always feared but never fully believed would come to pass. But as the rebellion continued, Constance's heartache deepened. She knew that regardless of the outcome, the Hohenstaufen legacy had already been irrevocably altered. Even if Frederick emerged victorious, the cost would be high. If Manfred succeeded, it would be a victory for the forces of local autonomy in Sicily. But it would also mean the end of Frederick's dream of a unified empire. The future of the Hohenstaufen dynasty hung in the balance, and Constance, the once steady anchor of the family, was powerless to prevent the unraveling of the world she had worked so hard to build. The rebellion in Sicily, a deep wound in the heart of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, was far from over. Manfred's challenge to his father Frederick was not just a rebellion. It was a struggle for the very soul of Sicily itself. The island had long stood at the crossroads of cultures, Islamic, Norman, Byzantine, and Latin, and had developed a fiercely independent spirit. Manfred, a son of both Frederick and Constance, seemed to embody all the complexities of this island. His ambition was tempered by a love for his heritage, and his heart, though full of fire, was rooted in the soil of Sicily. As the year 1234 wore on, the political situation became even more desperate. Manfred, despite his youthful inexperience and lack of formal power, managed to rally a significant portion of the Sicilian nobility to his cause. Constance, who had always known the nuances of Sicilian politics, saw this as the natural result of Frederick's long absence and centralization of power. The nobles, many of whom were originally loyal to the Hohenstaufen cause, had grown resentful of Frederick's increasing reliance on foreign mercenaries and his neglect of Sicilian customs and governance. In many ways, the rebellion was as much about the future of Sicily as it was about the future of the Hohenstaufen family. Constance, now far removed from the active governance of Sicily, could only watch as her son's conflict tore apart the kingdom. Despite her best efforts to keep the peace, she was losing her hold over the situation, with her son Manfred leading the charge against his father's forces. The divide in the family had reached an irreversible point. The stakes were higher than ever. Would the forces loyal to Frederick succeed in quashing the rebellion? Or would Sicily, under the leadership of Manfred, return to its ancient ways of self-governance? By 1235, Frederick's forces had regained much of the territory that Manfred had taken. But the situation was far from resolved. The rebellion had turned into a full-blown civil war, with the island becoming the battleground for the future of both the Hohenstaufen legacy and Sicilian independence. The fighting was brutal. Cities were sieged, castles burned, and the common people suffered. And yet, Manfred's appeal among the people of Sicily only grew. He was no longer just the rebellious son of the emperor. He was becoming the symbol of resistance to Frederick's authoritarian rule. In the midst of this turmoil, Frederick's focus began to shift. The urgency of the situation was clear to him. He had to end the rebellion, but he could not afford to appear as a tyrant. The nobility in Sicily, many of whom had supported his rise to power, had begun to fear the growing centralization of Frederick's rule. For some, the rebellion was as much about preserving their local privileges as it was about supporting Manfred. Others, however, were genuinely loyal to Manfred, believing he would restore the balance of power that had once existed on the island. The conflict became a tug-of-war between these competing visions of governance. Frederick, despite his imperial ambitions and his military prowess, had underestimated the emotional and political gravity of the situation. The loss of his son's loyalty was not just a personal blow. It was a threat to his entire empire. His imperial authority, already challenged by the papacy, was now being actively contested by a son whom he had once trusted. Constance, ever the astute observer, knew the war for Sicily was no longer just about power. It was about the survival of the Hohenstaufen family itself. The winter of 1235 was a turning point, with both sides digging in for a protracted struggle. Constance, in a rare moment of independence, began to reach out to the key players in the conflict, attempting to broker a peace. She knew that the longer the war dragged on, the more damage would be done, both to her family and to the kingdom she had worked so hard to protect. She sent emissaries to both Frederick's camp and Manfred's, urging for a ceasefire. Her message was simple, but it struck at the heart of the conflict. The future of the Hohenstaufen dynasty depended on reconciliation. The island of Sicily was not just a battleground. It was the cornerstone of their empire, the place where their legacy could either be solidified or destroyed. Her plea, however, fell on deaf ears. Frederick was unwilling to compromise, and Manfred, increasingly emboldened by his growing support, was not yet ready to concede. But Constance had not given up. She knew that the war would not end through military force alone. In the months that followed, she worked in the shadows, attempting to sway the opinion of the Sicilian nobility. Through letters, clandestine meetings, and quiet diplomacy, she worked tirelessly to remind them of the Hohenstaufen legacy, of the vision her husband had for a united and powerful empire, and of the role Sicily played in that vision. It was a difficult and often fruitless task, but Constance was determined to see it through. She knew that the future of her children, both Henry and Manfred, depended on finding some kind of balance between them. In 1236, Frederick began to realize that Manfred was not simply a rebellious son. He was a threat to the very unity of his kingdom. Though Constance's diplomatic efforts had failed to bring an immediate resolution, Frederick's growing concern for his dynasty pushed him to seek a more permanent solution. His response was swift and brutal. He ordered a full-scale assault on the remaining strongholds of Manfred's supporters in Sicily. The emperor's forces, now reinforced by mercenaries and loyalist factions, were prepared to crush the rebellion once and for all. But it was not just military might that Frederick was relying on. He began to deploy more psychological tactics, attempting to use the power of his imperial office and the weight of his legacy to win over the nobility that had once supported Manfred. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could either restore his rule or fracture it irreparably. For Constance, this period of escalating conflict was a time of great personal anguish. She had watched her sons grow into men with different visions for their kingdom, and now she could only pray that their differences would not destroy the empire she had worked so hard to help build. The summer of 1236 saw the tide of the rebellion begin to shift. Frederick's forces, bolstered by strategic alliances with other Italian powers and the loyalty of key noble families, began to push back Manfred's supporters. The young rebel prince, still determined to fight, managed to hold onto several key cities, but his forces were weakening. The once great hope of a Sicilian uprising was beginning to unravel, and Constance could only watch in silent dread as the war that had torn her family apart seemed to move toward its tragic conclusion. As Manfred's forces began to falter, Constance saw the handwriting on the wall. Though her loyalty to Frederick remained steadfast, she knew that her son's rebellion was not just an act of defiance. It was a reflection of the deep divisions within the kingdom and the family. The war that had been waged in Sicily would not only reshape the future of the island, it would also determine whether the Hohenstaufen dynasty could survive the fractures within it. As the year 1237 dawned, the shadow of impending disaster loomed ever closer over the Hohenstaufen dynasty. The rebellion led by Manfred against his father Frederick had caused irreparable damage, and the political rift between the father and son, once unthinkable, now seemed impossible to mend. Frederick, though ever determined to maintain his imperial authority, could no longer ignore the toll the conflict had taken on his empire. Sicily, the crown jewel of the Hohenstaufen holdings, had been ravaged by years of civil war. The island's cities had been destroyed, its people exhausted by the constant fighting, and its nobility, torn between loyalty to the Hohenstaufen name and their desire for local autonomy, were now fractured beyond repair. Manfred, though young, had proved himself to be a capable and charismatic leader. His rebellion, far from being a fleeting outburst, had gained momentum with each passing month. His supporters, including many of the powerful Sicilian nobles, saw in him a symbol of resistance to Frederick's ever-tightening grip on the kingdom. They believed that Manfred, born of both the Hohenstaufen bloodline and the Sicilian soil, would restore the kingdom's former glory and its unique cultural identity. Manfred, however, knew that his rebellion was not just about the island. He was not simply fighting for the future of Sicily, but for his place in the Hohenstaufen dynasty. His desire to reclaim his birthright, and his resentment toward his father's decision to place all the power in Henry's hands, made the conflict personal. In the early months of 1237, Frederick's army began its decisive push. The imperial forces, bolstered by foreign mercenaries and loyalists from northern Italy, launched a series of calculated strikes against Manfred's positions. Despite his ability to hold onto some of Sicily's key cities, the sheer might of Frederick's forces was too much for the young prince. The conflict had dragged on for years, and now Manfred, isolated and outnumbered, began to see the inevitable truth. His rebellion was crumbling, and there was no longer any hope of achieving victory through military means. Frederick, despite his earlier reluctance to engage in a protracted war with his own son, was now resolved to end the rebellion once and for all. The Hohenstaufen emperor, known for his intelligence and ruthless pragmatism, had long believed that power must be consolidated, and the survival of his dynasty depended on quashing any threats to it. He understood that Manfred's insurrection was not just a challenge to his authority, it was an existential threat to the very foundation of his rule. It was not simply the loss of Sicily that Frederick feared, It was the fracture of the imperial vision that he had spent so many years building. The unity of the empire, the dream of a powerful, centralized Hohenstaufen monarchy, depended on his success. And so, Frederick's forces pressed forward with unyielding determination. By the summer of 1237, the tide had decisively turned. Manfred, after holding out in several cities for months, had been forced to retreat to the mountainous heartland of Sicily, hoping to continue the fight from a stronger position. But Frederick was relentless. In early September, his forces cornered Manfred's army near the city of Cefalù in northern Sicily. What followed was a brutal and decisive battle. Manfred, though vastly outnumbered, fought valiantly, determined not to let his father's forces crush him without a fight. His army, though filled with loyal followers, was no match for the professionalism and strength of Frederick's imperial forces. The battle was fierce, and by the end of the day, Manfred's forces had been decimated. In the aftermath of the battle, Frederick's forces marched into Cefalù. Manfred, who had managed to escape the initial onslaught, was soon captured and brought before his father. The scene that followed was one of tragic inevitability. Father and son, once united in the dream of a powerful Hohenstaufen dynasty, now stood as adversaries, their relationship irreparably broken. Manfred, the once proud prince, was forced to kneel before Frederick, who, despite the sorrow in his heart, could not afford to show mercy. The rebellion had gone on too long, and the damage was too great. Manfred's fate had already been sealed. Frederick, known for his pragmatism and his unflinching determination, had always seen himself as a ruler who made decisions based on necessity, not sentiment. The moment of confrontation with his son was no different. Though he had tried to avoid this rupture, he understood that his empire, his legacy, was at stake. Constance, who had watched the conflict from the sidelines, had long known that the end was near. Her hopes for reconciliation had slowly faded, replaced by the grim realization that the family she had worked so hard to keep united was now irreparably divided. The decision to execute Manfred was not one Frederick took lightly. He had loved his son, but the rebellion had tested his authority and had left him with little choice. The execution, carried out swiftly, was a brutal reminder of the price of disloyalty. Manfred's supporters, many of whom had fought for his cause, were left devastated. Some were executed, others fled into exile. The rebellion was officially over, but the scars it left on the Hohenstaufen dynasty would not easily heal. Constance, who had watched the rise and fall of her son's dreams with a heavy heart, was now forced to confront the full consequences of the conflict. Her son, whom she had raised with love and care, was dead. The kingdom she had tried so hard to preserve was now in ruins. Frederick, though victorious, had lost the very thing that had once made him great, the loyalty of his family. The bond between father and son, once so strong, had been shattered forever, and Constance, though devastated by the loss of Manfred, knew that the political future of the empire rested on the survival of Henry, her elder son. But the death of Manfred did not mark the end of Constance's trials. With the rebellion over, Frederick turned his attention to consolidating his power once more. But the political landscape of Sicily had been forever changed. Constance, now isolated and grieving, found herself at the mercy of her husband's empire. The loss of her son, combined with the devastation of the kingdom, left her in a state of profound uncertainty. Would the Hohenstaufen dynasty continue to flourish under Frederick's vision? Or had the execution of Manfred permanently altered the future of the family? As the years passed, Constance's role within the court grew less influential. Frederick's reign continued, but the tensions between him and his surviving sons grew ever more pronounced. The tragic death of Manfred remained a dark stain on the Hohenstaufen legacy, and though the empire endured, the emotional and political cost of the rebellion would never be forgotten. The echoes of the brutal battle at Cefalù and the subsequent execution of Manfred reverberated through the halls of the Hohenstaufen court for years to come. Though Frederick's victory over his son had solidified his control over Sicily, the cost was high, and it was not just the land or the throne that had been affected. The very soul of the empire had been scarred by the bitter struggle between father and son. And now Constance, having lost both a son and the unity she once dreamed of, faced the ruinous aftermath of her family's civil war. Frederick, despite his successes, was left with a kingdom that was in a state of disarray, its future uncertain. The defeat of Manfred and the suppression of the rebellion had not brought peace to Sicily. Rather, it had created a deep rift that would endure for generations. The Sicilian nobility, once loyal to the Hohenstaufen cause, were now divided. Some continued to support Frederick's vision of a unified empire, but others, disillusioned by the brutality of the civil war, began to turn toward other powers in the Mediterranean. The wounds of the rebellion, though ostensibly healed by Frederick's military prowess, would leave a legacy of political instability that would plague the region for years. For Constance, the political landscape of the court had shifted irrevocably. The loss of Manfred had taken its toll on her not just as a mother, but as a political figure. She had once been the steady hand guiding the Hohenstaufen dynasty through tumultuous times, but now she was a figure sidelined by the events that had unfolded. Though she remained loyal to Frederick, the emotional distance between them had grown. Their marriage, once a partnership of shared ambition, had been tested by the years of political strife, and the pain of losing their son had only deepened the divide between them. Frederick, though grieving for his son, knew that the survival of the empire demanded that he press on with his plans. But Constance, ever the astute observer of the empire's shifting dynamics, knew that the Hohenstaufen dynasty would never be the same. By 1240, Frederick's imperial ambitions were taking a more pronounced turn toward centralization. The defeat of the Sicilian rebellion had left the emperor with little room for compromise. He began to restructure the governance of the kingdom, replacing many of the traditional local rulers with loyalists who owed their allegiance directly to him. The Sicilian nobility, weakened by the rebellion, had little power to resist, and Frederick's control over the island became more absolute. The centralization of power, while ensuring Frederick's authority, also sowed the seeds of future discontent. For many, the ideal of Sicilian autonomy, once championed by Manfred, seemed all but lost. The political fabric of the kingdom had been irrevocably altered, and the gulf between the emperor and his subjects continued to widen. Meanwhile, Constance withdrew further from the public sphere. Grieving the death of her son, she took solace in the quiet moments spent in the monasteries of Sicily. She had long been a patron of the church, and in these final years of her life, she found a measure of peace in prayer and reflection. Yet, even in the solitude of her religious life, she could not escape the weight of the political turmoil that had consumed her family. She had borne witness to the rise and fall of her sons, the ambitions of her husband, and the fracturing of the empire that had once seemed unassailable. The Hohenstaufen dynasty, for all its brilliance, had been marked by a tragic flaw: the inability to reconcile ambition with the bonds of family. In the end, the kingdom that Constance had worked so hard to protect was slipping away from her, as Frederick turned his attention outward toward his imperial duties, focusing on the struggles with the papacy and his ongoing campaigns in the Holy Land. Constance's role in the court became more ceremonial than active. Her son, Henry, had taken his place as the emperor's primary heir, but the relationship between the two had always been fraught with tension. Though Henry was Frederick's chosen successor, the emperor's overwhelming control over the affairs of the empire left little room for his son to assert his own influence. The future of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, now in the hands of a young heir whose relationship with his father was characterized by mutual distrust, was uncertain. Frederick, though formidable in his power, had alienated those closest to him in the pursuit of his imperial vision. But it was not just the internal strife of the Hohenstaufen family that threatened to undo Frederick's empire. The specter of external forces, particularly the growing influence of the papacy and the rising power of other European monarchs, cast a long shadow over the future of the dynasty. The papacy, in particular, had long been a thorn in the side of the Hohenstaufen emperors. Frederick's excommunication by Pope Gregory IX in the 1230s had further complicated the already fragile relationship between the emperor and the church. While Frederick had managed to maintain control over Sicily, his relationship with the papacy remained strained, and it was clear that the conflict between imperial and papal authority was far from resolved. In 1245, Frederick was once again excommunicated by Pope Innocent IV, further deepening the schism between the Hohenstaufen family and the papacy. Frederick's excommunication had far-reaching consequences, not only for his political standing but for the future of his dynasty. The emperor, now more isolated than ever, struggled to maintain his position in the face of growing opposition from both within his family and outside forces. The papacy, along with rival monarchs such as Charles of Anjou, who sought to supplant the Hohenstaufen in Italy, posed a serious threat to the stability of Frederick's reign. The years of conflict, both internal and external, had worn Frederick down, and his ability to maintain the empire he had built was increasingly in doubt. Despite the mounting pressures, Frederick's death in 1250 would prove to be the end of an era for the Hohenstaufen dynasty. His passing left a vacuum of power, one that would be filled by his son, Henry. But the unity that had once characterized the empire was gone. Constance, who had long witnessed the rise and fall of the Hohenstaufen vision, was left to reflect on the legacy of her family. Though the Hohenstaufen Empire had been great, it had been marred by internal conflict, and the dreams of Frederick and Constance had faded into history. Their family, once united in ambition, had fractured beyond repair. With Frederick's death, the Hohenstaufen Empire was plunged into a period of instability, one that would culminate in the eventual downfall of the dynasty. Charles of Anjou, backed by the papacy, seized control of Sicily, effectively ending the Hohenstaufen reign on the island. The family's dreams of a unified and powerful empire crumbled, and the once great legacy of Frederick II and Constance of Aragon was relegated to the annals of history. Yet, in the end, Constance's legacy was not just defined by the triumphs or failures of her family. It was also shaped by the resilience and endurance with which she navigated the turbulent waters of politics, war, and tragedy. She was a queen who had lived through the best and worst of times, who had fought for her children and her kingdom, and who had borne witness to the unraveling of a dynasty. Her story, though marked by loss and heartache, remains one of the most poignant in medieval history. A mother, a queen, and a political force in her own right, Constance of Aragon's legacy endures in the complex and turbulent history of the Hohenstaufen family, a dynasty that burned bright but ultimately faded from the stage of history. As the last echoes of the Hohenstaufen dynasty faded into history, so too did the memories of Constance of Aragon's remarkable journey. Her life, a complex tapestry woven with ambition, love, betrayal, and tragedy, had spanned the heights of royal power and the depths of personal sorrow. By the time of her death in 1250, just a few months before her husband Frederick II, Constance had witnessed the destruction of everything she had once fought to protect. Sicily, the island of her birth and the kingdom she had so fiercely defended, was now lost to her family. The Hohenstaufen dynasty, once poised to rule an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to Germany, had splintered and collapsed under the weight of its internal divisions and external enemies. Frederick II's death marked the end of an era for both the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Sicily. The emperor, though one of the most brilliant and ambitious rulers in medieval Europe, had failed to preserve his family's unity, and with his passing, the great empire he had strived to build quickly unraveled. His son Henry, whom he had hoped would carry on the Hohenstaufen legacy, was ill-prepared to deal with the political and military challenges that arose in the wake of Frederick's death. The Hohenstaufen Empire would never again be what it once was. The papacy, long at odds with the Hohenstaufen family, wasted no time in exploiting the power vacuum left by Frederick's death. Charles of Anjou, the brother of King Louis IX of France, was swiftly granted the Kingdom of Sicily by Pope Innocent IV, marking the end of the Hohenstaufen rule in the island. Charles's rise to power, supported by the papacy, was the final blow to the dreams of the Hohenstaufen family. Sicily, which had once been the jewel in Frederick's crown, was now firmly in the hands of foreign rulers, and the Hohenstaufen were reduced to mere exiles. But the legacy of Constance of Aragon, while undoubtedly marked by loss, also lived on in the quieter corners of history. Her marriage to Frederick, though strained and ultimately tragic, had been a union of two powerful dynasties, and it had produced children who would play crucial roles in European politics. Though Manfred's rebellion had torn their family apart, it had also highlighted the deep political and cultural divides within the realm, divides that were not easily bridged. Manfred, though defeated, had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol that inspired future generations to question the nature of power and authority. For Constance, the personal losses she endured, losing her sons, her kingdom, and, eventually, her husband, left a profound mark on the history of Sicily and the Hohenstaufen legacy. She had been a mother caught in the crossfire of a battle for power, her loyalty to her children torn between love and duty. She had been a queen who, though forced into the background by the forces of history, had quietly shaped the destiny of her family and the kingdom she had once ruled. Her influence, though subtle, had helped shape the course of the events that led to the rise and fall of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. In the decades that followed her death, the name of Constance of Aragon slowly faded from the chronicles of European history. The Hohenstaufen family, once the epitome of medieval ambition and grandeur, was relegated to the status of a tragic footnote in the rise of the papacy and the shifting balance of power in Europe. The Kingdom of Sicily, after decades of turmoil and division, was finally brought under the control of the papacy and the Angevin dynasty. Constance's children, Henry, Manfred, and the others, had all played their part in a drama that spanned generations. But in the end, their names were overshadowed by the larger forces of history. Yet, in the quiet reflection of those who look back on the lives of the powerful and the fallen, Constance's story endures. It is a story of a woman who navigated the complexities of love, power, and politics in a world that was rapidly changing. She was a queen who, despite the tragic events that unfolded around her, remained steadfast in her role as mother, wife, and ruler. Her life reminds us of the fragile nature of dynastic power and the enduring human cost of ambition. As for the Kingdom of Sicily, it would never return to its former glory. The Hohenstaufen family's dream of a unified Mediterranean empire was lost, but their story lived on, whispered among the ruins of castles and palaces once ruled by the great Frederick II and his beloved Constance. And though the names of the Hohenstaufen faded from the pages of history, their influence lingered in the politics of the Mediterranean, in the legends that were told of a dynasty that rose high and fell hard, like the tide of the sea. The end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty also marked the end of a particular vision for Europe, one where the emperor ruled not just as a monarch, but as a unifying force across a vast and diverse continent. The rise of the papacy, the consolidation of regional powers, and the increasing autonomy of kingdoms in Italy, France, and beyond would shape the course of European history for centuries. Constance of Aragon, despite the fall of her family, remains a symbol of both the enduring resilience of motherhood and the tragic limitations placed on women in power during the Middle Ages. She was more than just a queen or the wife of a powerful emperor. She was a woman caught in the crossfire of history, whose efforts to protect her family and her kingdom ultimately were swept away by forces too great for her to control. Her legacy, though faded by time, is a reminder that history is not just written by kings and emperors, but by the mothers, wives, and daughters who shaped the world from behind the scenes. For in the story of Constance, we find the tale of a woman who loved, lost, and, in the end, witnessed the dissolution of everything she had fought for. And in her grief, perhaps, she understood the most poignant truth of all: empires are not eternal, but love and family are.